What is cracking, my fellow photogs? Glad to be with you guys today. I hope this video is helpful because understanding what we're going to talk about today changed my photography game 100%, and that is understanding the exposure triangle. If you are just new to photography, or if you've had your camera a while and you want to start getting off some of those auto settings to have more control over your camera, this is your video. We're going to be talking about the exposure triangle with the three elements: the ISO, the shutter speed, and the aperture. We're going to look at what all three of those are and how they work together to create a properly exposed photo. Now, before we do that, there's one word that I need to explain to you guys that if you don't understand, you're not going to understand the exposure triangle, and that is a stop. What is a stop? You hear that terminology a lot. If you haven't, you will hear that terminology used often, and you need to know it. In the photography world, a stop is either cutting in half or doubling the amount of light given to your sensor to create a properly exposed photo. So if you take a picture and it's all blown out and all you see is white, you are overexposed according to what would be a properly exposed photo. So you need to bring down stops. You need to cut one of these three elements or a combination of them until you get a properly exposed photo. And each time you cut, that is considered bringing down, or well, in this case, bringing down a stop. So we are going to first address aperture. What is aperture? Well, aperture is basically just the hole in your lens that opens and closes. And the higher number that you have, so like these are your F numbers, your F22 all the way down to maybe F1.4, depending on what lens you have. If it's a lens that came with your camera, it's probably somewhere around F4 or F5.6, somewhere in there. And that determines how wide your lens opens to let the light hit the sensor. That is aperture. And so if you're, let's say, shooting a portrait, let's say you're shooting a person, you want the background blurry, you're going to use a wider open aperture because it compresses the depth of field, so it isolates your subject. But with that, it also lets more light in. If it's outside during the daylight, it might be too much light. So then you're going to have to go to your other settings and adjust those. Now, if you're shooting landscapes, you want to use upwards of like F11 all the way up to F22 to get that depth of field sharp all the way back. And that's the real basics of aperture. Now, shutter speed, super simple. All it is it is what determines how long your shutter stays open for. It doesn't determine how wide it opens. It just determines how long it stays open for. So you could have F22 where it barely stays open, but if your shutter speed, those are the fractions that you see on your camera, your 1/125th or 1/100th or 1/60th of a second, those are your shutter speeds. And if your aperture set at, let's say, F22, super small hole, no matter what size that hole is, your lens is going to stay open for however long your shutter speed tells it to stay open for. So if you're shooting at night, if you're shooting landscapes at night, you want it a slower shutter speed. But if you're shooting portraits, you can't go too slow because then your subject will move or your hand will move and create blur. So I would say if you're just starting out and you're shooting off of a tripod and you're shooting people, definitely do not go below 1/60th of a second, 1/50th, but that is absolute minimum I would go. If you're shooting on a tripod, that's a little bit different, but you also need to make sure that your subjects are able to stay still enough. Lastly, we have on that triangle, we have ISO. Now, ISO is much more complicated than what we're going to get into on this video, but the basics of that is, it is how sensitive your sensor is to the light. So think in terms of if you get a sunburn and then you go back out into the sun, you could feel that sunburn immediately because your skin is ultra sensitive to that light hitting it. That's the exact same thing with your ISO. Is the higher the ISO, the more sensitive your sensor is to that light coming in. The lower the ISO, it's like you haven't got burnt yet and you're loving the feeling of the sun. That's the same thing, but you can be out in the sun longer, and that's the idea of lower ISO. To create a properly exposed photo. An easy way to remember this is with what's called the bucket analogy. It's super common, but it's really helpful. We are going to pretend like we have water coming out of the sky, whether rain, whatever, and that is going to be our aperture. That determines how much rain is coming down. So like how much light is coming through the lens would be our aperture. And then we have our buckets. Now our bucket is 5 gallons. Let's say it's 5 gallons, and we need that bucket full to create a properly exposed photo. So we have our rain coming down, And then we have how long that bucket, through our shutter speed, how long that bucket is sitting under the rain filling up. Now our ISO, it determines whether that 5-gallon bucket is wide and shallow or if it's skinny and tall. Now if it's wide and shallow, it's gonna collect more rain and fill up quicker, which means that we don't need it to be under there as long, and we don't even need as much rain coming down on it. But if our ISO is low, which I like to keep mine as low as possible in almost every situation, then it's gonna be taller and skinnier, which is gonna be harder to fill up. It's gonna take longer to fill up, and it's not gonna catch as much rain. So what I need to do, if I wanna leave my ISO low so I avoid getting noisy photos, is I need to leave that alone, so it's gonna be tall and skinny. And then I need to go and adjust the time that that bucket is sitting under the rain, or I need to adjust the rain and have more rain come down, or in our case, more light come down through to hit that sensor. I hope this has been helpful, you guys. The graphics my buddy Mo made, go check out his website. It's in the description below. If you know anyone who has been struggling to figure out how to use the manual controls on their camera, or if this has been helpful for you and you just want to learn more, please guys, I'd love it if you subscribed, shared, and hit like. Until next time guys, go practice, have fun, and create some art.